I am Laura Humm. I'm one of the Dialogue Doctor editors, and I'm here with Mark August today to work on. Mark, this is a new piece for you, right?
It is. I've gone through and spent some time working on this piece. It's the last book in this six-book series, and I'm really looking forward to building a little bit more of my craft because I love writing with large casts.
Yes. And you have a big cast in this scene. I love
I
it.
do. I do. I enjoy having the interaction between the different characters, and I think for this type of series, it makes a lot of sense.
Excellent. What type of series is it?
So I'm Mark August. I'm a fantasy author. I've got 12 books out on Amazon right now. We're going to talk about my 13th book. So I have a little bit of experience of working with a different cast. My first series is six books, and that was a multi-character, multi-POV type endeavor with multiple voices, different types of dialogue, antagonist, protagonist, everybody was all mixed in. And that book was really geared toward a young adult, new adult, college age type audience. And I learned a lot with that series. And I thought this multi POV isn't the easiest thing to do. It's fun when you've got these different voices and you have something specific, but it's hard when you're starting to do dialogue. So
Hmm.
the second series, the one we're going to talk about, is my Arcane Mercenary series. And in the title, you kind of get this is a company of heroes, we'll call them. They're not always heroic. And that's part of the character's development and the character journey. But I focused through all six of these books on one main character, and that's my main character, Grant. A lot of sword and sorcery, very epic background in this, and it all culminates in this book. It's planned on, I'm finishing up with this one. I'll move on to other projects in the future. But one of the things I really enjoy about writing with the multiple characters is sometimes you can have fun, you can tell different jokes. I'm not limited by first person POV sometimes. The
Hmm.
third person POV gives me a chance to move the camera where I want to in the scene, get really up close and personal with Grant, or back away to the command tent or a staff meeting or a meeting with kings and queens that happen through a lot of these books. So the story that I'm trying to tell is really fixates on Grant, but tries to expand to a fun cast that isn't just constantly first person in one person's head.
Excellent. It's always fun when you have the ability to take the story into, like you're saying, different um, perspectives might be the right word, real up close or a little bit further back. That's great.
Right.
So obviously, as an author of a series, you are hoping that by the sixth book, your readers have read at least some of your previous books. But at the
Yes.
same time, you have to make sure that your sixth book stands alone because if somebody comes across it as a new read, they have to be oriented to it. So that creates a challenge in that you need to be able to establish characters quickly for the people who already know the characters, but in depth enough for the people who haven't read your characters. So that is a fun, tricky twist. You don't pick easy challenges as an author, do you?
Well, I think it kind of goes with what story you're trying to tell.
Yeah,
And I think the story of these mercenaries demanded that cast, hard or not,
yeah.
and then trying to get through it. But you're right. I guess I really didn't think about up front when I started the series, either one of them, to constantly go back and not give a recap, but a reminder of, hey, by the way, Grant's in charge, his second in command, his first sergeant, some of these different people and why you should care about them, not in a page length format, but even a paragraph or two will go a long way to introduce and yet remind at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. And that in and of itself is a really tricky skill. I have a tendency when I'm reading for fun to find an author that I love who writes the same character over and over and over and over again. So when they release a new book, it's like meeting up with an old friend. But I always love how they can slide those gentle reminders in without being like, well, in the last story, these things happen, right? Like just those small amounts of reminder details that, you know, help orient if it's been a long time since I've read. these characters, or if I hadn't read them, it's just enough to be like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Maybe when I finish this book, I can go back and read another book. Because, often you do pick up a book in the middle or towards the end of a series and get really excited about it. So we can talk through a little of that today as we're looking at this, because you have given me chapter 2 and 3 of this book. What's happening in chapter 1?
So chapter one kind of gives a little bit of synopsis of what was going on in the previous plot.
Okay.
Um, Book five ends with a big victory of the good guys. They install a new king. One of the characters who appears and has been sort of an off and on relationship with Grant. She takes the throne with this other guy, but then they're called back to where books 1 through 3 take place to say, hey, the big conflict that I've been telling you about this whole book, it's really now about to happen. It's all hands on deck. Everybody who can fight needs to go back to, we'll call it the homeland, if you will, and get involved. And so that first chapter is sort of the difficulty of, I've got to get out of this island kingdom. I have to move all of my thousands of soldiers back to the mainland. This is where we see where some people are really good at logistics. Grant is not and doesn't care that much because he's got people who do that for him rather
Mm-hmm.
than being just the boss and giving orders to everything. We get a little bit into a reminder of the politics. The person who's the queen was supposed to be the empress of where they're going back to. There's a little bit of tension that if she goes back to the mainland, is this another coup, which happened in book 4, where he
Mm-hmm.
tried to lead a coup to overthrow the established government. So the chapter 1 sort of gives a quick synopsis of those key events from the couple of books. But chapter 2, the reason why I sent that to you instead of chapter 1, because we're really starting to get back into the characters rather than the geopolitical,
Mm-hmm.
um, 5 book synopsis of this is where we are today. And so kind of getting back into those characters is really where 2, and then a little bit more where there's a lot more exposition in 3 versus the character driven part of
Mm-hmm.
chapter 2, which is why I sent you those 2 chapters.
Excellent, excellent. Do you, in your chapter 1 kind of recap synopsis, setting the stage chapter, are you introducing these characters, or is it more like hey, this is the world that these characters are living in. Now let's zoom into the characters themselves in chapter 2?
So what I tried to do in chapter 1 is I actually tried to mirror the exact opening from book 1,
Oh, fun.
where Grant is standing with his hand on his sword, muscles popping, veins, all everything is tense, the body is ready to go, and he's frustrated by the situation he's in. In the first book, he's staring up at the defenses of this enemy position that he knows he's going to be ordered to storm and he's going to take huge losses. By book 6, he's this very accomplished commander who's frustrated that he has to go back to war and this gale has blown through this island nation and he can't move forward. He's stuck on an island and he hates dealing with the regents. That's not his thing. He wants to get
Mm-hmm.
away from the bureaucracy and the pomp and circumstance and move away. So I actually mirrored the exact opening from the first one to the
Hmm.
last one to give people a little bit of, hey, I'm going to show you how far he's come in the previous, I don't know, couple thousand pages you've already read in
Mm-hmm.
to get here. So that's kind of how it opens. And so Grant gets a little bit, as his second in command gets a little bit of discussion in there, and his first Sergeant Jafron get just a little bit. It's
Nice.
not a dialogue heavy, character reminder heavy
Mm-hmm.
piece.
Okay, great. So, really, chapter 2 is the first place where you're reintroducing the characters to your reader.
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can look at what you sent.
Yep.
And can you see it?
Yep, I sure can.
Excellent. That's the fastest it has ever come up. It usually like the screen freezes. And even since it didn't freeze, I'm going to talk about it freezing. So, okay. These 2 chapters are just over 3,000 words. And they are kind of orienting the reader to what's happening. You've got a lot of characters going here. And because there were so many characters, so you've probably, if you've listened to any of my editing sessions, you've probably heard me say the first thing I do when I edit is I do a read as though I am the reader. And I'm trying to like, figure out where the story is. And I actually, it's not unusual for me to like skip ahead in the book to figure out if I want to read it by like reading a chapter that's a little further into the story, just to see like if I like the writing style, because we all have preferences of genre and writing style and those sorts of things. So it's not unusual for me to jump ahead in the story. So I like to see kind of what happens in some of the later chapters. So I went through and I read, and I found myself asking some questions as I was reading. And that's okay, right? Like when
Right.
you're writing a story, sometimes you want your readers to have questions. The trick is always making sure they have questions about the thing as the author you want them to have questions about. So after I went back and I read it, I went through and I found that I had a difficult time keeping track of who was who character wise, which
Okay.
again is something that is very like I don't want to say it's unique to me, but it's something that I have difficulty with a lot of times if there's a large cast, trying to remember who's who, or I'll remember who's who, like in the like relationships of it, but I don't remember whose name is whose. And like I do that a lot.
Okay.
So when I'm reading a story like this that has a big character cast, when I start seeing new characters, I have to like go back and read those paragraphs multiple times. That's not an author thing. That's a me as a reader. I know that if I'm going to enjoy a book with a large cast of characters, that's what I have to do. But I do think that there are tricks as an author that you can do to help orient readers like me. And I want to show you some of those today.
Perfect. Thank you.
Absolutely. So, in the start of your second chapter, you've got one, two, three, four paragraphs of orienting the reader to what's happening. You mentioned Grant swearing like a sailor from the deck of his command ship. So, immediately I picture a big ship and the person in charge. I don't know if I knew he was in charge or I just assumed he was in charge because he was swearing. Doesn't matter. That's what I saw. And then even Ez didn't dare to risk the wrath as he fumed. Now you mentioned that you introduced Grant and Ez in chapter one, so I'm okay with just kind of understanding that they have some kind of relationship. He's in charge. She's not in charge, but she clearly is the one who like has his ear just from this first sentence.
Okay.
And then there's a lot of background about as is in charge of the logistics team. They're trying to get into port, and there's a lot of other ships there. So there's a little bit going on there. And then you've got this note that through his spyglass, Grant assesses the chaos. So this works for world building. But if you want to pull me in right from the beginning, it's always nice to take something like this, where through a spyglass, he's assessing that there's growing chaos. Maybe up here, it's this is chaos, Grant swears from the deck of his command ship. And even
Okay.
as did, right? Like, so something that immediately puts us in Grant's shoes. Because
Okay.
if you wait for paragraph number 5 for someone to speak, that's especially right on the heels of a whole chapter that's kind of orienting me as a reader. It just allows me to zoom in just a little bit faster. The other thing is, the only two people that I know are actually there in this moment are Grant and Ez.
Okay.
I assume because they're on a deck, there are other people, but we haven't mentioned them. We talk about the logistics team, but we don't really tell who's in the logistics team. We don't tell if they're there. Is it the two of them? Is it not? Either way, it's okay. I just don't quite know yet. So
Okay.
then Grant says, can you pronounce the name of this place
Yeah.
for me?
Alan.
Alanan. Okay,
Yep.
just like it's spelled. You
It
said Alan
is.
Ann would be better as, Grant said, controlling his anger by choking his sword's hilt, right? So we see that he's angry. We see that he's controlling his anger with very specific words. And then you have Ez say, if you wanted better information, you should have waited 2 more days for the advance team to report. Now, we know that they have, from the previous books, from the last chapter, that they have a relationship that might not be as typical of the person in charge and the second in command, where she can be a little bit more honest with her opinion than maybe a typical hierarchical relationship. However, we still don't know who else is around.
Okay.
If you have other people in this scene, I'm questioning why this person in charge, who's already controlling his anger, is already mad because whatever plans he has on land are being thwarted by all of these other ships. And then my second in command is smart mouthing me by saying that it's not their fault, it's my fault. That feels a little like, ooh, what's going on in this relationship? But
Okay.
then if I scroll down to the next page and I see that there are other people there, now I'm questioning as the reader, is this Grant guy really in charge? Is he the person that I really want to follow? That's
Okay.
my guess is that might not be the direction that you want your reader to go if Grant is your POV character. At the Dialogue Doctor, if you've listened to it or if anybody who's listening, we typically call that the vehicle character because we're going on the journey with them. So if that's the case, if you want in this book Grant to be a strong, like in charge commander um, that people don't question, or maybe he's the strong commander who allows people to speak their voice, but only respectfully, then this language from Ez can be transformed a little bit more. So maybe it's instead of if you wanted better information, we should have waited. Maybe she said something like, um, without the advanced team's report, we didn't really know what we were getting into, right? So it's like this, I can only do so much, which kind of feels like what she's doing, but
Hmm.
without saying to him, hey, you might have made a bad decision. Don't blame it on me. So kind of depends on which way you want to go. And as we're talking about that, because again, when you are building these big casts, the relationships between the people become really, really important, especially when you have two people like this. Because in the synopsis you sent me, as is Grant's love interest a little bit. So if there's like a personal relationship along with the working relationship, maybe when the doors are closed, they're equals and she's allowed to say something like this. But when there's an audience, she knows her place and she uses the voice that's much more reserved and much more respectful. So either way works. Just something that I wanted you to know as the author of what I was seeing as I was reading this. Like, oh, wait, maybe she's just the feisty second in command that he's like, you know what? She gets her job done. Everybody knows that I'm actually in charge. It's fine. Maybe it's not. So just something to bring up there.
So the last part you said is the relationship they have. And it starts on the first page of the first book that she's the only one who can get away with talking to him, which is why when you scroll down to the next page, his
Mm-hmm.
first sergeant calls him captain. Hey,
Mm-hmm.
this is a bad idea. I can speak my mind, but you're still the captain. And it's sort of a reminder to everyone the boss is trying to make these decisions. So, but I do appreciate because I never looked at it from the perspective that you brought out that reader,
Mm-hmm.
whoever might say, well, I need to know more about this relationship. Is it normal? Is it abnormal? And what does it mean for the rest of the book? So I
Right.
think I need to round that out just a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. And you can do that pretty easily by having Grant respond to Ez here and maybe helping us know who else is here because what you've got is Grant speaking, Ez speaking, and then one, two, three, four more paragraphs of background before Jafron speaks. But notice Grant doesn't speak again for another 5 exchanges. So
Okay.
now you've got the person who's supposed to be in charge being told by the second in command that he made a bad decision. And then you have the next person in command again suggesting that the captain has done something wrong. And then more people speak before Grant even like responds to them.
Okay.
So, as a strong leader, maybe all he says here is, I'm going to go ahead and track some changes. And again,
Sure.
this is like some weird editorial liberties that I'm going to take here. But the idea being just so that you can see what you could do
Sure.
if you were thinking about it. So maybe what happens here is he lets her get away with this and he says, noted, right? Like, I'm, fine, right? Like, we're going to let you. But then maybe he immediately says something to everybody else to like remind them that they can't get away with speaking to her like that. So maybe he says to Jafron or Rayanne. Is that how
Yep.
you say it?
Rian. Yep.
Rian,
Yep.
maybe he asks them a question to help again orient us to who's on this deck with them, or um, bringing them into the conversation to like distract away from her. So just
Okay.
anything to respond so that we know that he's not just ignoring this insubordination. He's like, this is the relationship that they have, and because she brings logistics that, or maybe he says something back to her instead of noted. He's like, yeah, but I thought logistics were your thing.
Okay. Sure.
Right? And again,
Yep.
this is a very different exchange if it's the two of them than if they have an audience. So maybe what you want to do is you let the two of them have this like private moment where he's in charge, she's allowed to press him. They have this like cute little whatever moment. And then Jafar comes up on the upper decks the way that Rianne is. And instead of saying it's a bad idea, he says, what are you thinking, Captain? So
Okay.
again, you're reinforcing this idea that everyone else is respectful, but he and Ez have a different relationship when no one is around. Plus,
Okay.
then we don't have to think about who's here because you're giving us this private moment with them. And then you're telling us when other people are joining the story instead of us getting to the top of page 2 before we start to see who else is there. So maybe
Okay.
Jafron and Rayanne walk up together and he says, what are you thinking, Captain? And then again, you have Ez kind of cutting Grant's legs out from under him. This is a bad idea, Jafron says. Rayanne says, what's he thinking? And Ez is like, assaulting the beaches. It's in his blood, right? Like, this is what he's going to do without even like deferring to the person in charge. So again, you want to create that relationship in a way that if the first officer, because that's her second in command, what's
Sure. That's close enough. First
okay.
officer. They're not
So
naval officers, but it's close enough.
okay. So if she's constantly like cutting him off at the knees or belittling him or like coming at him, then that's going to create this idea that, some peon who's in the lower ranks sees this all the time, might not understand that they have a special relationship and they're going to say something to him and he's going to like explode on them because it's out of protocol. And then there's a question about like who's actually in charge. So
Sure.
just something to think about as you're writing those things. Plus, it's really exciting for the reader when we know two people have like a private relationship to see how they talk to each other when it's just the two of them differently than how they talk to each other when when other people are around, right? Like
Okay.
it's fun for us because then we are in on the secret and
Right.
we can see that. So something to think about in there. The other thing is you mentioned that you gave in chapter 1, you helped reorient us to Grant, you helped us reorient to Ez, but now you've added two other people in here. You've got Jafron and Rayanne, and I have no idea who they are.
Okay.
I don't know what their roles are. I don't know what they're supposed to be doing. I I don't know why they're there, right? So like if you can help me as the reader, whether I am a first time book reader or if I have read all 5 of the previous books, you can just help me like orient to him. And he's the first sergeant. I'm reading the email you sent to me.
Yep.
So maybe it's, what are you thinking, Captain? I'll actually just write it in here for you. Because again, we don't want everybody challenging him in your first scene. And I'm going to just go ahead and capitalize Captain so that we are seeing that it's a title, and
Okay.
not just like, hey, buddy, right? Um, First Sergeant Jafron Saeed said as he moved
Mounted the stairs or
up
something.
to the railing by Grant's side, right?
Yep.
Now you're giving him motion, so we're seeing that he's being added to the scene, right?
Yep.
And then I did like this. It's about like he already knew what the captain was thinking. I did really like that, especially because you're showing that Rayanne here doesn't really know what's happening. She's kind of new to the situation. So maybe instead of what are you thinking, Captain? Maybe the first sergeant says, are you up for? Are we looking for a fight here, Captain?
Sure.
Something that it's like still showing that he knows without the disrespect that Ez is allowed to put in there.
I like
Um,
it.
so then you can, and then it can actually be, and she doesn't have a title, does it in the email that you sent me?
She doesn't. She's sort of the outsider to this group.
Okay.
She appeared in book 1 and kind of latched onto the group in this throne room. And a lot of the readers are like, hey, this is suspicious. And I'm like, good, you picked up on book 1 that she's got her own agenda. Now she's loyal, she's faithful, and she desperately wants to be part of this group. That's kind of her thing. And in this book, about 40 chapters from now, the big reveal happens for what she's wanted all along, and she has used them to get to where she wanted to be. It's the betrayal theme brought out by some of Grant's closest friends. In this case, it's Rienne. So she doesn't have a formal title. She's sort of an ambassadorial type person. She's trained in
Okay.
the courts. She does all the stuff with the nobility that Grant doesn't kind of want to do. So she's more of a bard, spy,
Okay.
um, that type of role.
Okay, I love
Does that
that. So,
explain?
yeah, so let's do this. So we say, what's he thinking? Rayanne Yarwood asked. Grant still hadn't given her a title, but appreciated the way she talked with the nobles.
Sure.
Again, complete
I'll clean it up.
editorial liberty. Like
Yep.
you'll man. I'm just the editor. I'm not the writer, right? Like,
Got it.
something to orient the reader to who she is, what she's doing here, instead of just giving her name. Now, you have Ez like, again, pointing this additional passion that she has right at Grant. But now there's an audience. So maybe you have it so that Ez doesn't trust Rayanne because she's been kind of this hanger on her. And while Grant and Jafran are like, she's helping, like, just let her, nobody maybe Ez is the one who's like, what are you even doing here? Right. Like, so maybe she points that passion at Rayanne, because if she's been kind of hanging on since book one, and this is the book that reveals what her true nature is, you want your readers to have that brought right to the forefront of their mind right in the beginning. And if you have Ez be the one to do it, because the way that I'm seeing her, and again, I've only read 2 of your chapters and a brief synopsis, but it seems like she's like ride or die with Grant, right? Like, she's going to put herself in front of him if there's danger or whatever. And her little spidey senses might be going on that, like, hey, something isn't right here. So if you let your readers, whether they're new to the series or they've read before and have just kind of gotten used to Rayanne, which it seems like if she's been around for a little while, they would, so that when she betrays them all later, Ez can be like, if you had just listened to me the whole time, right? Like, but letting the reader in on this, hey, maybe she's not who she says she is. So even though Grant trusts her and Jafran trusts her, Ez is still kind of keeping her at an arm's length.
You've
Again,
you've nailed their relationships. You actually summarized exactly what's gone on for the past few books. That simmering dislike between the two of them, both competing for Grant's attention, is exactly what's going on. So I think that's a great place to put that.
okay. So then instead of her going at Grant, she can then go at Rayanne. So I'm just going to add what are you even doing here? But I'm going to put it in brackets because you'll figure out what actually goes there.
Sure.
Okay, so then once you've got Jafran, who's kind of like questioning, and then Rayanne, who's like, but what's going on here? And like, Ez starts to get, and they're moving away from the direction of what Grant is trying to do, which is get all these people onto the shore past all of these ships. Instead of him groaning and shaking his head and like kind of talking about these people, let's see him take that leadership position and just step up. Right. And instead of saying, we can't sit here in the harbor and wait for them to sort this out, maybe he says, we're not going to sit here in the harbor and wait for them to sort this out.
Okay.
Right. So now he's taking charge, and everybody else knows, okay, no more playing around. Now it's time to be in charge, right? So maybe we don't even need this paragraph to kind of
Okay.
show what's going on, because we're watching this relationship and he's kind of letting them do their thing until he's ready. And then he kind of takes charge.
Okay. I like it.
So so now instead of the line by line, I just want to take a second and I want to just look at Grant and the way he speaks through your scene.
Okay.
Because when you have this strong in charge character with this big cast of characters around them, right? You've got Ez, who's like kind of a lot of passion, some romance, some like, I'm going to point this, you wind me up, point me in the direction you want me to fight with you, right? And then you've got Jafran, who like knows him so well, knows what his idiosyncrasies are, and has that relationship where he can kind of be the quietish guider of where you're going. And then this person who's like trying to like shoehorn their way in. We want to be able to see who Grant is. So
Okay.
one of the things that I did for you that I do a lot of times when I'm editing, a lot of people have probably heard me say this, is I color coded the lines. For anyone who's watching and can see, you've probably seen my color coding already. But Mark, for you, green was Grant for me. I don't know why, but he was green. So you've got him. We noticed it up here. He starts as spoke, and then he didn't speak again. We added a line there to, again, kind of, when people are in charge, they're used to, in most cases, being the first one and the last one to speak in a scene. So just kind of bookending as with that also gives us a little bit of insight into the relationship. I like that he's not the first to speak in this part of the scene, because again, it's kind of like a continuation. They know their role, they're showing up to see what's next. And then, he kind of lets them go about their business speaking before he steps in. And again, just changing that line from we can't to we're not going to, just that one small change changes the amount of control this person has, right? Like, we
Right.
can't do
Right.
this versus we're not going to do this, just a little bit extra. So then they start to speak again, and then he raises his eyebrows but says nothing. And then some more stuff happens, and then he says, let's go ashore. And then Ez says something, and he says, but we'll do this instead. And then he gets on shore and he says, we're looking for the harbor master. And then he doesn't speak again for quite a few paragraphs. And then when he does, he's like explaining himself a lot. And then he's like very gracious and generous. So as you're kind of looking at his lines, in that same way, we took this line and we went from a little bit passive to a little bit more control. We didn't push him to like angry. We didn't push him to mean or aggressive. We just pushed him a little bit more into control. So perhaps instead of raising his eyebrows and saying nothing when they're talking about bribing people on the beach, maybe he takes a hard line here and he says, we may be mercenaries, but we don't resort to bribery.
Okay.
Again, with this idea that mercenary has a very negative connotation, but you have these mercenaries being the heroes of your story. So something there, and that might not be the right thing, but like something to again exert that control instead of just raising the eyebrow and letting them kind of go. Because I can see them again, that like, who's in charge here? If
Okay.
they're allowed to kind of have their own little, I can't think of the word, but like, I can say whatever I want in front of you and it's fine. It makes me as the reader question, is he really in control? Does he really want to be in control?
Okay.
And it seems like because he's your point of view character, he's been winning all these battles. You told us in book one, he's like standing there with a sword and is like ready for battle or just finishing a battle. We want to see kind of that same leadership in the story as we go. So there are a couple of ways that you can work on this. You can take the story just as it is and highlight like I did and just go through and look to see kind of what he says and what you can do to make it more of a command. So like when you get here to Grant says, let's get ashore, this doesn't feel very commanding to me. To me, if he's going to lead the group ashore, plus this is actually going to help orient the reader to what's happening and who's going ashore, because when he says, let's go ashore, who's going? Is it just the four of them? Is he bringing more people? What's going on? So this is that little author's trick that you can do where in dialogue, you can help orient what's happening. So maybe he says, we're going ashore. As get your logistics team ready. I want 5 whatever's. Um, uh, Jafron, sorry, I had to look up his name. Jafron, you're going to bring whatever your role is. And then he looks at Rayanne for a minute and is like, and you can come along too, right? Like whatever it is, like let him give an order, because
Okay.
let's go ashore is like, we're all kind of sitting here at a coffee shop trying to figure out what, are we going to go to the movies? Are we going to go walk in the park? What are we going to do? And finally somebody's like, well, let's just get going, right? That's different than this guy who's in charge of this whole group of mercenaries. I still don't actually know how many there are. Um, right. So, like, thinking about that, like helping us orient that you can just let him take that moment of command and move that story forward so that they can go on shore. The other thing you can do is you can tell them what their jobs are going to be when they get on shore. So maybe it's, I'm taking this boat to shore because, again, I don't really know a lot about boats. But if the harbor's full and there's nowhere to dock, how are they getting off the boat? You've got here in the next line that they're lowering the longboats. How many longboats is he taking? Where are they going to go? Right? Like, just if you, instead of relying on the pros to tell us that, let him take command. Let them ask some questions about that. So maybe Grant says, we're going ashore, get your people ready. And then maybe instead of Ez saying, we're not storming the beaches, she says, where are we going to dock the longboats? He can say, that beach over there, right? And then you can like help us understand what it takes to get these people to the shore. And then maybe he says, and then maybe you have Jafron say, who do you want to go, if Grant doesn't say it initially? Or, Grant says, we're going to take 2 longboats today. These people are going to be in boat 1, these people are going to be in boat 2. When we get on land, as you and I are going to find the harbor master, right?
Yeah.
So again, just this idea of like, what is coming next? Let Grant take that ownership, help orient the reader to what's happening. It'll allow you to minimize some of this prose, obviously not all of it, because they're, after he says this, they actually have to get to the harbor. And then you mention the harbor master quite often, but they don't actually ever talk to the harbor master. Excuse me. They talk to a soldier and then they talk to a representative from the harbor master's office. So again, I had a question. You've got Grant, who is a little bit more passive in this scene. Is he being passive because he hates the logistics of this and he's letting Ez, who's great at this, handle it? If that's the case, then as they are like walking up to the soldier, Grant's like, you're going to take care of this for me, right? And she's like, don't I always? Because again, if it's just the two of them, the intimacy of that relationship can come across, so that when they get to the soldier, her taking charge and like hefting the wealth bag to like try to move things along makes sense, that it's her and not him that are doing it.
Okay.
And then again, when you're introducing somebody new, you mentioned that the soldier steps aside and allows the representative to move forward to inspect the gathering of mercenaries on the beach. I have a couple of questions in the sentence.
Okay.
Who's the representative? Representative of the harbor master? What's her role? Is she really in charge? Is there somebody that we can go around? Because if this is chaos and I'm trying to go around, I'm not going to talk to a representative. I'm going to skip her and I'm going to be like, I'm going to go talk to whomever. Maybe they can't do that. And then when you're saying the gathering of mercenaries on the beach, are they on the beach where we have the longboats, or are we at the docks where they're actually unloading? And part of this is just, I don't have enough understanding of like movement in a harbor,
Okay.
um, to know like what's actually happening here. And in some ways, as an author, maybe that part doesn't matter because what matters is like there's confusion and frustration that's going on here. But if you want your readers feeling that confusion and frustration that you've got Grant feeling with his blood boiling here, let us feel that, right? So maybe they come up and they're like, hey, we're on orders, which you actually have Rayanne saying way down here, we're on orders from the Empress to be here. If I'm in charge of a ship and people are laughing and shaking me off up here, and I think that this is the way to get the job done, I'm going to say it right up front. I'm not going to
Okay.
wait for this person who doesn't even really have an official title that, again, I wasn't even sure was there to say it. So what I'd just like to see a little bit more of is the intensity of the feelings by maybe taking out some of the prose and just focusing on the words. So here you've got Grant's blood boiling as he considered 5 dozen ships waiting. So maybe the representative from the harbor master says, we're working on ships based on arrival, right? And then Grant's like, but there are 5 dozen ships out there. And she's like, hey, you have to wait for your birthing time. And he's like, we're not waiting, we're on orders. And maybe it's not him doing this, maybe it's Ez doing this, and he's kind of stepped out of it because he doesn't want to see that. But if you create that tension with the back and forth with the short sentences, we as the reader, when we have those really short sentences with the back and forth, it really puts us in like we don't have any time to think about anything else. And some of these other things that you've put in your prose, if you're moving it into the dialogue, it it helps us to see what's happening better because we're seeing it through the character's eyes.
I
That makes
actually like
sense.
that a lot. No, man, that's fantastic.
Excellent, excellent. So the last thing that I want to show you, there are lots of color coding. There's lots of kind of some notes in the margins. But the one thing I want to do, I want to skip through to the end of chapter 2 and like jump into I don't know if this is the end of chapter 2 or the start of chapter 3. But one of the things that's really important when you have multiple characters in the scene is making sure you are relying on your dialogue tags to ensure that the reader knows who's speaking. If you have 2 people in a scene, you can rely on just the back and forth in the dialogue so you know who's talking. But there are a couple of places in the scene where you have Ez saying something, Grant saying something back, and then you've got a paragraph which feels like it might be Ez, but you're not actually saying that it's Ez. But Jafran and Rayanne are actually in the scene.
Sure.
So while I might be assuming that this is Ez, now when you tell me that these 2 other people are in the scene, I'm like, oh, wait, was that Ez? Do I have to go back and read it again and think about it? Now you've taken me out of the moment and moved me into a question that you didn't want me as the reader asking. You want me as the reader asking why Ez is so mad about this, not, wait, was that Ez or is somebody else jumping into the argument? And it happens again, like right after you say he was alone with Ez's fury, and somebody says something else, but we're not marking it specifically that it's Ez. So just like kind of keeping in mind when you have multiple people in the scene, you can't rely as much on those tricks that you can when it's just 2 people in the scene and it's like, oh, we know who's speaking. Does that make sense?
It does. And the funny part is I actually took the dialogue tag out of those sections because I was just trying to keep the back and forth going quickly between the 2 of them, but I broke the flow between the 2 of them when he looks off to the side and say, you guys gonna help me?
Right.
So that makes sense that when I broke the flow, I have to clean it up. for a
Except
particular reason.
except that what I love that you just said is that when you have four people in the scene, you can't actually have flow between two people unless you get the other people out of the scene first. So, like, if the two of them, so like we know Rayanne is here, but I actually didn't even know Jafron was here until Grant looks at Jafron. So this is again where way back up here, when they're getting off the ship, if you're giving the orders, um, making sure like everybody in your scene is accounted for. And I do have an exercise that I recommend for people who have trouble maintaining who's in their scene and who isn't in their scene. And you may have heard me talk about this before because it's one that I use kind of a lot. Um, you take a piece of paper, and as people are coming into the scene, you take a little figure or you draw their picture on and you write their name, and then you're kind of keeping track at every line, like you can either move them around if they're moving, or you can like point to them. Sometimes I'll use tally marks to see how many lines they have, because then all of a sudden, if you mention Jafron and he's not on your page, but now all of a sudden people are looking at him or people are talking to him, now you know, oh wait, I got to bring him into the scene. How did he get here? You either have him walking up like we did way back up here on page 1, where he now, or I guess page 2, where now he's walking into the scene, so we're orienting. So sometimes I find that just additional visual aid helps me keep track of who's in the scene, who's speaking, when do they go silent. So maybe there are 4 of them in the scene, and Grant knows that Ez is about to go off on him. So he says, he looks at Jafron and Rayanne and he says, you all go over there and do that. So he can have this private conversation where as can, especially if he knows her and he knows that she's about to go off on him like she does. Maybe he sees that she's simmering and he's like, okay, you all go off over there. And then you don't need the dialogue tags because we know it's just the 2 of them.
Okay, I like that.
Yep. Yeah, so that's the big thing. And then just one other thing as you are moving your scenes, just making sure that we know where they are and how much time has passed. Because as I was started reading chapter 3, I was confused about kind of where they were, what they were doing. Are they still on the dock? But then in the middle of the scene, you're showing that they're like at a farmhouse in a new headquarters.
Okay.
So just that extra, and you can do that in dialogue. So, you know, Ez brings him a cup of coffee and says to him, you know, how do you like the new headquarters? And maybe he says, well, I didn't really like having to walk 2 miles from the dock and leave our ship with whomever's there, but it was great. And then maybe she says something like, well, you know, you wanted to bring 45 soldiers, 45 mercenaries, 45 whatever you're calling them. They had to stay somewhere. We had to get
Right.
out of town, right? Like, so taking the things that have happened and putting it in the dialogue makes it a little bit easier for us to orient, again, see what's happening instead of being told what's happening.
Okay.
And you've done something really, really smart in your cast of characters by the relationship that you created between Grant and Ez. Lots of times when you create a character who's in charge, like Grant, they don't trust anybody. So they don't tell them what they really think and feel about things. So you have to use a lot of prose as an author to orient the reader to what's happening. You've created this relationship where they're honest and they're truthful, and she can speak her mind when no one else is around. So, like, he can say things like, why did I have to walk so far? And she can say, well, you know what, we're gonna climb up on somebody's roof and I don't know, whatever it's, like you can create that because they have that relationship. So some of the things that naturally feel like it's going to be prose, he has a confidant. He can tell her instead of it being in prose, which helps the reader stay just in that moment with them.
Yeah. I actually like that a lot.
Good, good. What questions do you have about? We did a lot today. We talked about making sure that all of your characters in a scene have voices. We talked about making sure that the person who's in charge's voice feels strong and commanding instead of just, hey guys, let's yeah, we talked about a couple of things. Any questions, thoughts, something else you wanted?
Yeah. So Laura, I mean, you've read a lot of books across a lot of genres. So my question is, when you're approaching these large casts, like I said, in my first series, I actually gave people different accents. They'd use different words, and it was fun. And the readers kind of, I mean, you could close your eyes, or
Mm-hmm.
you could wipe out all the exposition that was in there, and you could just read the dialogue with no tags, and you could tell who was who. I found that this group was so big that I wasn't going to be able to kind of in without listening to somebody but reading their words, I wasn't going to be able to do that. Do you think that's really necessary, or kind of the way that you're describing their voices portraying their actions, is that enough on a big cast like this?
That is a great question. And, we're the dialogue doctor, so we're always going to say voice is critical.
Right.
That said, if you have somebody who only ever speaks once, does the nuance of their voice matter as much as Grant and Ez's voice? No. What I would recommend that you do is you focus on your core characters' voices and then start using a chorus when you get into the larger scenes.
Okay.
So, right now, most of your scenes have four characters plus somebody else. So, if you focus on making sure that Grant is always strong and commanding, unless he's in a conversation with just he and Ez, you're creating this short sentences. There's no ambiguity in what he's saying. He's always in command. He's always in control. You're doing what you're saying you did in the other one, where it doesn't have to be an accent. It doesn't have to be like a trick, if you will. It can just be the structure of his sentences. They can always be, we are doing this, period, Grant said.
Okay.
It can always be that formula when you are talking about Ez, who like has all of this passion and is like always wound up. She's always looking for a fight with somebody, whether it's with Grant or with the harbor master person, or whether, right, like it doesn't matter. You can use dialogue tricks with her a little differently, in that she's always looking for the fight. So anything that she says is like has that connotation of I'm right on the edge. For her, I would actually put her dialogue tags in the middle of her sentences. So
Okay.
she like growls a little bit, and then she like she did with the gold, right? Like, hey, are you going to move this along? She hefts the bag. This, we're in a hurry, right? So like her body language is in the middle, that's showing that menacing nature that she has, but she's using her body language to punctuate what she's saying. So maybe she says something, she puts her hand on the hilt of her sword and then finishes her thought, because her body language is what's showing. So in that earlier scene where we changed it a little bit so that Rayanne was like, what's going on here? And she's like, what are you even doing here? Maybe she curls her fists or squints her eyes or like shakes her head or something to say, like, I'm watching you. And then she finishes her thought.
Okay.
Because then her body language becomes part of her voice. And then you don't have to worry about, does she have an accent, or, what kind of catchphrase is she using that sort of thing. When you're talking about somebody like Jafran, who kind of seems like the level-headed, reliable, I kind of see what's going on, I'm going to help guide, I'm going to make Grant his best self. Maybe his dialogue tags always come at the beginning, and it's always like they looked at him, he looked thoughtfully for a moment, um, or he starts with, I wonder, whatever, because if he's saying, I wonder, and he's challenging, it doesn't feel as harsh as if he's just, right? So, like, you can create those little idiosyncrasies about the characters at that level. If you start with your 4 or 5 main characters, then when you have somebody else come into the scene, right? Like you have in the first scene, the representative from the harbor master. In the second scene, you've got Mercedes, right? Like if Mercedes' voice and the harbor master voice sound the same, doesn't actually matter because we don't care about them the way
Right.
we care about your main 4 or your main 5.
Well, I definitely appreciate that. That's a good perspective, and I'll definitely go through on this next revision pass and nuance it. My second question for you is, okay, you've read a couple chapters of mine. I've written a couple books, got some great stuff out there. Where else do you think I need to focus as a developing writer? I can't say new, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
but developing writer, where else do you think I should look?
Yeah. Well, and I love that perspective of like, no matter how many books you've written, there's always something you can develop. There's always something else as an art. Um, this again comes like from the idea, we talked about it just a little bit, but like in the dialogue doctor community, we really focus on dialogue centric scenes. And while you have a lot of dialogue in your scenes, you also are breaking that up with a lot of prose.
Okay.
One of the reasons why I like to color code is because we can see exactly what the ratio of your character voices are to the prose. And just by kind of scrolling through, you can see, like, even when you have Grant talking, it can have the appearance of prose because it's a long paragraph instead of taking dialogue and he's talking to somebody. So he says the first part, let's talk to the harbor master and get our troops off the ship. Maybe Ez says to him, we're definitely going to need more horses. And then he can say, let the Empress take care of her problems while we address ours, right? Like, it doesn't, when you're writing a dialogue centric scene, thinking about how the words and body language someone is saying impacts everyone else around them becomes what's central, not just necessarily telling the story. So, where I would recommend, again, coming from a perspective of dialogue being what connects you to your characters, finding ways of things that you traditionally put in prose. So, like in here, you have them changing scenes. And we talked about this a little bit. They're changing scenes, they're getting to the farmhouse, giving me some of that in conversation as opposed to giving me 3 or 4 paragraphs of prose really helps keep the pacing for the reader of I can't look away. Um,
Okay.
and that's because when we hear people tell a story, the closer we're connected to that story, the harder it is for us to look away. When we're being told the story versus, hey, come here and experience this story with us, which is what dialogue does. We're in the moment, we're talking about it, we're connecting. It's a lot harder to let me use an analogy here. If your phone rings, you're more likely, as long as it's not a telemarketer, you're more likely to pick up the phone and talk to the person on the other end of the line and put whatever else you're doing to the side. But if
Right.
you get an email, that is telling the same story, it's a lot easier to be like, oh, I'll go back to this email later. Let me go over and do this other thing.
Sure.
And that's kind of the difference between prose and dialogue is, am I getting this information in an email or do I have somebody telling it to me? If
Yeah.
you can put as much of your story on the telephone, which is like a very weird thing to say, but put it in the dialogue
I get
instead
it.
of putting it in an email, I think that that would help create just a little bit faster pacing
Okay.
in your story. And
Okay.
that's not right for every author. Some authors really, really enjoy writing the prose. And it works, especially in the fantasy genre. There's a lot of world building that happens in prose. So maybe what you do is to kind of stay in the genre is you add the dialogue as part of the prose. So instead of 4 paragraphs of prose, you have an exchange of dialogue, a paragraph of prose, an exchange of dialogue, paragraph of prose. So you're still kind of keeping to tradition in the genre, but
Yeah.
you're also allowing your readers a little bit closer of a connection to your characters than they can get from the prose.
Okay.
So,
I really appreciate the time that you spent going through this. It's a unique perspective, especially when you're in book 6 and you think everybody knows the characters. I don't have to spend a lot of time with the setting, but it is a callback, a gentle callback to earth to say, you still gotta sow the field. You can't
yeah.
just assume that the crops are all bloomed and everyone's ready to go for the last book. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, what I love about what you just said there is that it works wherever you are in your story, right? Like taking the time to just adjust your character voices in the edit. If you're in chapter 30 of a 35 chapter book, or if you're in chapter 2 of a 7 book series, the investment that you make in your characters to just make those small little tweaks. Sometimes there are larger tweaks that need to happen, but
Sure.
just if you can take that time to refine so that your characters have a consistency, it readers, whether they can articulate it or not, are going to appreciate that, because when they're reading, they're investing in you, but really they're investing in your characters, right? Like they want to spend time with Grant and Ez because, they want to see themselves as part of this fantasy. So if they like them and they feel consistent, it's a reward for the reader. Because how many times have we read a book and we get to about the halfway point and we're like, feels a little inconsistent from my character. And now, as a reader, I'm not thinking about where the characters are. I'm wondering what happened. What did I miss in the story that is making the character act like this instead of the way that I thought they were going to act? So I love that you kind of like are thinking about it from the standpoint of just because my readers know my characters, just because they've spent time with them doesn't mean that in this moment I can just rely on that. I sometimes have to like remind them because
Yeah.
maybe they read the first 5 books, but then they had to go, do something else, and it's been a couple of months since they've read them, or they read the first 10 or 12 chapters of the book, but it's been 2 weeks since they've been able to pick back up. Helping them pick back up wherever they are with that consistency helps jog the memory. So
No, I appreciate it. My wife likes to say they're your characters, but they're my friends. And I think sometimes going back to reestablish the friendship, I get it. It makes a lot of
mhm.
sense to do it.
I love that. That's such a neat quote. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead and turn the recording off.
Okay. Thank
I
you.
have to stop sharing first. I figured that out the other day. I mean, I don't have to, but it's easier.